Today's episode of the Video Vortex focuses on Italian horror legend Dario Argento. Now, some of you might be more familiar with his more modern work, which isn't as critically appraised, but in the early 1970s into the 80s, Dario Argento is considered one of the great masters of horror films. And his career started out quite nobly in a way, despite having a famous father as a producer, Salvatore Argento. He actually started working as a critic, a bit like the kind of French New Wave directors like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard about 10-15 years before him. And what's interesting is he actually got his big break working on the screenplay with Bertolucci for Sergio Leone's classic western Once Upon a Time in the West. After working on the screenplay, Argento decided to direct his first movie, which released in 1970, called The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. People started to draw comparisons with the great British author Alfred Hitchcock, comparing it to his 1960 classic Psycho. And there are some similarities, there are some excellent set pieces, and often in Argento films there is a central character or two who are framed for a crime that they didn't commit. And you see that in quite a lot of Alfred Hitchcock films, particularly The Wrong Man, starring Henry Fonda. In The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, there is an excellent supporting cast of players behind the scenes and in front of the camera as well. One of note is Ennio Morricone, who scored over 300 different movies. He's an Italian music legend, and he scored the soundtrack to the next three Argento films, which are collectively known as his Animal Trilogy, linked by animals referenced in the title. So the first one's Bird with the Crystal Plumage, the second one is Cat o' Nine Tails, which Argento's not an enormous fan of looking back. He felt it was too Americanized, like a lot of American thrillers. And it stars Carl Malden and James Franciscus, who was almost like a B-movie Charlton Heston, and it's not a bad one. In my opinion, it's a bit overlong, but it's a strong movie. And I think the most underrated of the three, and my personal favourite, is Four Flies on Grey Velvet, which got an excellent shameless DVD release a couple of years ago, starring Dempsey and Makepeace star Michael Brandon, and that's an interesting murder mystery. Argento went on to direct a film that was a kind of historical comedy called 5 Days in Milan, and this didn't do too well at the box office, even in Italy. So he decided to return to what had made him famous, a type of film that referred to as giallo. Now that becomes from kind of pulp novels that were released in Italy that had a yellow cover, and the Italian word for yellow is giallo. So they're kind of pulpy stories. Often considered to be the first one is Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much. But I personally think that one of the greatest giallos ever made is his next film, Profondo Rosso, the English title of which is Deep Red. Deep Red is a classic zero. There's an excellent lead performance by David Hemmings. Some people say he looks a bit like Paul McCartney in the film. I can see the connection a little bit. He kind of got into European films from starring in Antonioni's film Blow Up, which was made in kind of swinging London in the late 1960s. You also get the first appearance in an Argento film from Dario Argento, who'd later gone to be his partner for about 10-15 years, and had been an enormous influence on one of his next films called Suspiria. Now, Suspiria is a horror classic. A lot of famous people such as Quentin Tarantino and rock legend Alice Cooper absolutely love this movie, and it's like watching a nightmare. It's absolutely incredible, and it's the second movie to feature the Italian prog rock band Goblin. They'd worked on Deep Red and produced an excellent score for that, in my opinion their finest, but there's something truly classical about the score for Suspiria, well worth checking out. The film was an enormous influence on John Carpenter, and you can see influences of Argento in his classic movie Halloween. So there's the music score, which is very much influenced by the Suspiria score, and also the scene where they go to pick up Michael Myers from the sanitarium. You can see some shots of Dr. Loomis and the nurse are framed in kind of red and blue lighting, and that's very much like Suspiria. Suspiria is the start of a trilogy of films. The second movie is called Inferno, which came along with big backing from 20th Century Fox a few years later. Interestingly, Argento was quite ill during production, and the movie, even though it's a big favourite of some Argento fans, and know the critic Alan Jones absolutely loves it, but it's not one of my personal favourites, to be honest. It's got a kind of sickly kind of quality to it, and it's interesting these comparisons to Hitchcock don't really fit too well, particularly with this film. Alfred Hitchcock was a particularly linear director, so quite obvious plotting from plot to point in order that the events are supposed to take place. Inferno's all over the place. It has a weird kind of nightmare-esque logic, and you either go with that or you don't. I think it works terrifically in most of Argento's films, but for me, I'm not a big fan of it. Some people criticise that movie for the music score. Goblin didn't appear on the soundtrack. It went to Keith Emerson of the prog rock band Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Some people have criticised his score. I think the tune, which is a kind of reworking of a Verdi classical music piece, Taxi Ride, is absolutely incredible. I absolutely love it. It's actually based on a taxi journey one of them had gone on in a taxi through the centre of Rome, and it's like thrashing about and stuff like that. I think it's a pretty decent music score. The end is a bit of an anti-climax, but you know, it's not one of my favourites. The third film in the trilogy was made many years later as The Mother of Tears. It was about, to be conservative, about 25-30 years later. He used a lot of CGI in the movie, and I'm not a big fan of that. So I've not actually seen that one yet, but it's got some not very good reviews compared to the others. Safe to say, for the last few films I mentioned, we can see the influence of Dario Argento, his partner, and often somebody that starred in his films. She was very much wanting to add a supernatural edge to his films, and you see that in the previous two. She does make a small appearance in his next movie, Tenebrae, from 1982, but she actually filled in for another actress at the last minute. She doesn't have a particularly meaty role. This was very much a kind of classic giallo, and I think it's quite underrated. It was one of the films that they tried to ban under the Video Recordings Act, so it's considered a video nasty. And I do believe that one of the main women in it is the one-time wife of Silvio Berlusconi, who was the Italian president or prime minister for a little while. So he actually banned the film on TV. I don't think he wanted to see his then wife being cut up into pieces in the movie, but I think it's quite an underrated film. There's a great appearance from horror legend John Saxon, who appeared in Nightmare on Elm Street and several other films. He appears in Cannibal Apocalypse as well, which is well worth checking out. Not his finest hour, he was in a lot of movies, but yeah, he's a welcome appearance in it. Interestingly enough, the theme to the movie by Goblin was actually remixed a couple of years ago by, I don't know if they're a group or it's a DJ, but Justice in the UK. So I went into HMV, that's a music store in the UK once, and I could just hear the theme from Tenebrae being remixed, you know, with a bit of a beat to it, like kind of like Daft Punk do with some tunes. I just ran up to the guy at the counter, I'm like, did you not know this is the theme from Tenebrae? He looked at me as if I was from Mars, but that's a nice little memory that I have. Then Dario Argento went to direct a film in 1985 called Phenomena. Now I think Argento's still at the top of his game here. I actually really like Phenomena. The last kind of 20 minutes is absolutely exhilarating. The pace does fluctuate quite a bit, but I think what's particularly interesting about Argento is, and he kind of takes this from Hitchcock in a way, his kind of inventive camera techniques. Particularly there's one in Tenebrae which goes all the way around this apartment, around the roof. Now in the days of like Steadicam like we have today, this might not seem revolutionary, but at the time this was incredible. This was something that you'd look out for. There's some brilliant stuff in Phenomena. You get a great central performance by Jennifer Connelly, who just starred in The Labyrinth and films like Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in America, that was it. And she's pretty good in that movie. You get Dario Argento appearing as well. And what's interesting about that movie is it's very much a coming-of-age kind of drama. It's interesting that one of Dario Argento's daughters actually appears in the movie quite early on. And he'd often go on to work with his other daughter, Asia Argento, in some of his later films. It's an interesting kind of father-daughter collaboration. In one of the movies, she's quite brutally raped in it, and I can't imagine a father wanting to see the daughter go through that. But in this movie, Phenomena, you get an excellent performance from Donald Pleasance as well, who was famous for being in some John Carpenter movies and The Great Escape, and he's really good in it. And of course you get the famous image of the monkey with a kind of switchblade razor, which is a great central image. It always reminds me of one of the posters for George A. Romero's Monkey Shines, but it's well worth checking out. It doesn't quite hang together as some of the other Argento films. You do get something that starts to sneak in around this era, and it's the use of heavy metal music. I'm not an expert in this field, but you can hear the rock singer Lemmy singing quite loudly in one scene, and I noticed this first in a film that Argento wrote the screenplay for. called Demons. I think he did it for Demons 2 as well, but he wrote the screenplay for 2 of Lamberto Bava's movies, and they were incredibly popular. Well worth checking out the second one. There's a scene where Dario Argento's dancing to a Smiths song, and that was just incredible. The second one's not as good, but it's worth watching for that particular scene. But that heavy metal influence kind of comes into some of his later 80s movies. It was the time of MTV after all, the kind of late 80s. But his real underrated film, in my opinion, is Opera, also known as Terror at the Opera, which I think is a really good movie. I remember seeing it around the time that film Black Swan was out at the cinema, and to me they're equally as good as each other. It's about a kind of operatic production of Macbeth, and it's all about the legend of you're not supposed to say good luck, you're supposed to say break a leg, because there's a curse around the play, and there's a murder that happens and they have to try and solve out who it is. And I think it's really stunning. I really enjoy it. There's some completely outlandish camera work in it, and then there's like a raven's point of view, and I don't want to spoil the film, but you see the point of view of a raven gradually flying around this room, and you think that they're going to identify the killer. Oh, it's just sensational. I love that movie. Well, the end of the film is a nod to the original ending of the book Manhunter. I can't remember the guy who wrote it. Harris, is it Thomas B. Harris? Thomas S. Harris, something like that. It was adapted into a film by Michael Mann, starring Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. And the director Michael Mann changed the ending of the film to the book. So basically the ending of Terror at the Opera mimics the end of Manhunter. And there's a really interesting link at the end of the film back to Phenomena. You can read that quite literally, or you can take that metaphorically, but I don't want to spoil the ending. It's well worth checking out, Terror at the Opera. In 1990, Argento co-directed with George A. Romero 2 Evil Eyes, which is an adaptation of 2 Edgar Allan Poe stories. And I think Argento's story is the strongest of the 2. I'm a big Romero fan, but I found his story a bit disappointing. And it wasn't the first time they collaborated before. Argento was very much involved in the making of Dawn of the Dead in the late 1970s. He even recut the film for a kind of stronger European audience, because American censorship was quite heavy at the time in the late 1970s, and got Goblin to appear on the score a lot more. It's worth checking out. There's a really funny over-the-top performance by Harvey Keitel in there. Then he went to America to work in Hollywood on a film called Trauma with Brad Dourif. Tom Savini worked on the special effects for that. I've only seen clips of it, so it'd be unfair to review it. And then you get the appearance of the quite majestic and the fabulous Asia Argento, one of his daughters, in a film called The Stendhal Syndrome, which to many is considered his last hurrah in a way. I think there's some really interesting stuff in there. It's not the best movie in the world. It was the first Italian movie to use CGI. If you've seen any old CGI movies, it looks incredibly dated now, some of the scenes. But it's a nice little pot boiler in a way. And it's interesting with a lot of filmmakers from the classic era, like Carpenter, Argento, Wes Craven. And you see it against lesser directors as well. To me, the film grammar kind of dilutes a little bit. So you used to have like these beautiful sweeping camera angles on dolly grips and things, fantastic editing, but now it's all like handheld cameras, and it loses that romanticism, that element of craft to me. And a lot of people have criticised Argento in particular, and I don't want to slag Argento off. I'm a massive fan of his earlier work, but he was so brilliant at what he did to dilute that with some of the films he's made in the modern era, like Dracula 3D and Giallo starring Adrian Brody. These movies are just terrible compared to the brilliant films he used to make. Argento's promised another masterpiece in the work. He's working on a movie called Sandman at the moment. Right, you can stop laughing now. But, you know, his last couple of films weren't great. But I would strongly recommend some of his great movies. If you're going to focus on a Giallo, I think Deep Red is a great place to start. There's nothing wrong with the American cut, which is actually a trimmed down version. I personally think it's a bit better. It takes away some of the kind of Italian humour, which doesn't necessarily transfer that well to other markets. For out-and-out horror, Suspiria is a masterpiece. One of my best friends says it's the greatest horror movie ever made, and in terms of atmosphere, I think it's absolutely superb. You get a great appearance by Udo Kier in there as well. And it's a kind of underrated kind of movie. If you like your kind of 80s movies, I think Terror at the Opera, or Opera as it was known, is well worth checking out. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Video Vortex. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about the mighty Dario Argento. Thank you very much.